flight.
Keep those hands where I can see them. Put them out the window, now!
I'm not moving.
Do it! Taser, taser, taser!
Ah!
Out! Get out of the car, right now, out! Hands behind your back, roll over, do it!
I'm Chief Washington.
Stay down, don't move.
The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness like a blade. Officer Marcus Turner stood at the driver's side window of a dark gray sedan, his heart pounding against his ribcage, his mind racing with possibilities. The vehicle had pulled over smoothly onto the shoulder of Ridgemont Avenue, its tires crunching against the gravel that lined the edge of the road. In the distance, the lights of Ashford City flickered against the night sky, indifferent to the drama unfolding on this quiet stretch of suburban roadway. Marcus could feel the weight of his service weapon on his hip. His other hand gripped the department-issued taser, thumb resting near the activation switch. The night air carried the faint smell of cut grass from the nearby golf course, mixed with the exhaust fumes still rising from his patrol car idling behind him. Crickets chirped in the darkness beyond the reach of his headlights, creating an almost peaceful soundtrack that stood in stark contrast to the tension building in his chest. What happened next would destroy a career, expose deep flaws in how police officers are trained and supervised, and spark a conversation that would ripple far beyond the borders of this mid-sized American city. The driver sitting patiently behind the wheel of that sedan had no idea that in less than 60 seconds, thousands of volts of electricity would course through his body. And Officer Marcus Turner had absolutely no idea that the man he was about to assault was his own chief of police. This is the story of one devastating mistake, the cascade of consequences that followed, and the uncomfortable questions it forced an entire community to confront. If you appreciate stories that dig deep into the human side of extraordinary events, consider subscribing to this channel and staying with me until the very end. What unfolds here will challenge everything you think you know about authority, accountability, and the split-second decisions that can alter the course of lives forever. To understand how this moment came to be, we need to go back and examine the two men whose paths were about to collide so catastrophically on this quiet Tuesday evening in late October. Marcus Turner was 29 years old, 3.5 years into his career with the Ashford City Police Department. He had joined the force with what he described in his application as a desire to make a difference in his community. His background was unremarkable in many ways. He had grown up in the suburbs, played football in high school, and spent 2 years at the local community college before deciding that law enforcement was his calling. He passed the physical and psychological evaluations without issue, graduated from the police academy in the middle of his class, and began his career with the same mix of nervousness and enthusiasm that characterized most rookie officers. But there were warning signs from the beginning. Small things at first. During his field training period, his supervising officer noted that Marcus seemed to approach situations with an unusual level of intensity. Where other rookies might hang back and observe, Marcus pushed forward. Where department protocols called for verbal de-escalation as a first response, Marcus often jumped directly to more forceful options. His field training officer, a veteran with 17 years on the job, wrote in one evaluation that Officer Turner demonstrates a concerning tendency to interpret ambiguous situations as threatening. He shows initiative and physical courage, but needs significant improvement in reading situations accurately and calibrating his responses appropriately. That evaluation was filed away. Marcus completed his training and was assigned to regular patrol duty. Over the next 3 years, he accumulated a record that was decidedly mixed. He made several solid arrests and received commendations for his willingness to work overtime and take on undesirable shifts, but he also generated complaints. Citizens accused him of being unnecessarily aggressive during traffic stops. One formal complaint alleged that he had drawn his weapon during what should have been a routine noise disturbance call at a college party. The investigation into that incident was inconclusive, with witnesses offering conflicting accounts, and Marcus was cleared of any wrongdoing. His personnel file grew thicker with each passing year. A pattern emerged in the pages of those reports, visible to anyone who cared to look closely. Marcus Turner was a young officer who consistently overestimated threats and underestimated the power of patience and communication. He saw danger where others saw ordinary citizens going about their lives. He reached for force when other tools might have served better, but patterns are easy to miss when you are not looking for them. The Ashford City Police Department, like many law enforcement agencies across the country, was stretched thin. Supervisors had dozens of officers to monitor. Internal affairs investigations took months to complete. Training budgets had been cut for 3 consecutive years. The warning signs in Marcus Turner's file were there, but they existed in isolation, scattered across different documents that no one ever assembled into a complete picture. On the night in question, Marcus was working the 6 p.m. to 2 a.m. shift in the department's Western Patrol Zone. It was a Tuesday, traditionally one of the quieter nights of the week. The evening had been uneventful. He had responded to one call about a suspicious vehicle that turned out to be a realtor taking photographs of a house that had just been listed for sale. He had written a single speeding ticket to a teenager who had been going 52 in a 35 zone. Otherwise, the radio had been quiet, and Marcus found himself cruising the streets of suburban Ashford with little to occupy his attention. This was precisely the kind of shift that troubled officers like Marcus found most difficult. Without real incidents to respond to, his mind had a tendency to wander, to construct scenarios, to imagine threats lurking behind every set of headlights that passed by. He found himself growing restless, eager for something to happen, something that would justify the uniform he wore and the weapon on his hip. It was shortly after 9:30 p.m. when he noticed the dark gray sedan traveling westbound on Ridgemont Avenue. The vehicle was moving at a normal speed, staying properly in its lane, showing no signs of erratic driving. But something caught Marcus's attention. The right rear taillight was out, just the brake light portion, not the entire assembly. It was a minor equipment violation, the kind of thing that officers might address with a simple warning or might ignore entirely depending on their mood and priorities. For Marcus Turner, on this quiet night when he was hungry for action, it was enough. Now let us turn to the other man in this story, the one sitting behind the wheel of that sedan with the broken taillight, completely unaware of the life-altering encounter that awaited him. Chief Darnell Washington had spent 32 years in law enforcement. His journey had begun on the streets of this very city, walking a beat in one of its toughest neighborhoods during a time when crime rates were high and community trust in police was even lower than it is today. He was 24 years old when he graduated from the academy, a young black man entering a profession that had not always been welcoming to people who looked like him. The obstacles he faced in those early years would have broken many people. He was passed over for promotions that went to less qualified colleagues. He was assigned to the most dangerous and least desirable posts. He endured comments and treatment that he never discussed publicly, but that left scars nonetheless. Through it all, he maintained a commitment to excellence that eventually became impossible to ignore. Over 3 decades, Darnell Washington rose through every rank the department had to offer: patrol officer, detective, sergeant, lieutenant, captain, and finally, 4 years ago, chief of police. He was the first African American to hold that position in Ashford City's 140-year history. His appointment had been met with celebration in many quarters and with quiet resentment in others. He was acutely aware of both reactions and determined to prove himself worthy of the trust that had been placed in him. As chief, Darnell Washington had implemented reforms that modernized the department while maintaining the trust of the officers under his command. He expanded community policing programs. He increased training requirements. He pushed for the adoption of body cameras, believing that transparency served everyone's interests. He held his officers to high standards while also defending them when they were unfairly criticized. He was respected by the rank and file even when they disagreed with his policies because they knew he had walked in their shoes and understood the challenges they faced. On this particular Tuesday evening, Chief Washington had spent nearly 4 hours in a budget meeting at City Hall. The City Council was considering a proposal to reduce the department's overtime allocation, and the chief had been called upon to explain why such cuts would compromise public safety. He had presented data, answered questions, and advocated for his officers with the same passion and precision that had defined his entire career. By the time the meeting ended, it was after 9 p.m. Darnell was tired. His eyes felt heavy and his neck was stiff from sitting in the uncomfortable chairs in the council chamber. He had loosened his tie during the drive home and draped his suit jacket over the back seat. His thoughts were on simple pleasures. His wife would be watching television in the living room. There might be leftovers from dinner in the refrigerator. The basketball game between the two teams competing for the conference championship would be starting soon, and he hoped to catch at least the second half. He did not think about the broken taillight on his sedan. He had noticed it about a week earlier and had made a mental note to get it fixed. But life as a police chief meant constantly juggling priorities, and a minor equipment issue on his personal vehicle kept slipping down the list. It was a $38 repair at most, a trivial matter that he would get around to eventually. As he drove westbound on Ridgemont Avenue, enjoying the quiet of the evening and the familiar streets of the city he had served for over 3 decades, Chief Darnell Washington had no idea that his failure to address that small problem was about to collide with the much larger problems festering in the personnel file of an officer who had never learned to control his impulses. Behind him, the red and blue lights of a patrol car suddenly flashed to life. Darnell checked his speedometer. He was doing exactly 37 miles per hour in a 40 zone. He was not speeding. He ran through a mental checklist of his driving over the past few minutes. He had not run any red lights. He had used his turn signal when changing lanes. He could not think of any reason why he was being pulled over. Then he remembered the tail light. A small sigh escaped his lips. It was an annoyance, nothing more. He would accept the warning or the ticket, thank the officer for doing their job, and be on his way. He pulled the sedan smoothly to the shoulder, put it in park, and turned off the engine. He placed both hands on the steering wheel where they would be clearly visible. This was standard practice, something he had done thousands of times when he was a patrol officer himself. He knew how traffic stops worked, knew the importance of putting the approaching officer at ease, knew that the first few seconds of the interaction set the tone for everything that followed. What Chief Washington did not do was reach for his badge or identify himself as a police officer. This was a conscious choice, one that reflected his deeply held principles about equality under the law. He believed that every citizen, regardless of their position or status, should be treated the same way by law enforcement. He did not want special treatment simply because of the title he held. If one of his officers pulled him over for a legitimate reason, he would accept the consequences just like anyone else. It was a principled stance. It was also, as events would demonstrate, a tragically optimistic one. Outside the sedan, Officer Marcus Turner was approaching. His flashlight was already in his hand, its beam sweeping across the back of the vehicle as he walked. His other hand hovered near his sidearm. His heart rate, according to the fitness tracker he wore beneath his uniform, had jumped from 72 to 94 beats per minute. His body was preparing for confrontation before his mind had any real reason to expect one. As he walked, Marcus ran through his standard approach protocol, but his thoughts were colored by something else. Assumptions, interpretations. The dark gray sedan was a nice vehicle, a late model import that probably cost $45,000 or more. The neighborhood they were in was quiet and affluent, the kind of place where such a car would not be out of place. But something about the silhouette he could see through the rear window made Marcus's instincts flare. The driver was a large man. Marcus could see that much. He could also see, or thought he could see, that the driver was black. And in that moment, in the deep recesses of Marcus Turner's mind, a story began to write itself. A story that had nothing to do with a broken taillight and everything to do with the biases and assumptions that 3.5 years of police work had failed to correct. Maybe the car was stolen, maybe the driver was intoxicated, maybe there were drugs in the vehicle. Maybe this quiet Tuesday night was about to produce the kind of arrest that would impress his supervisors and advance his career. None of these maybes had any basis in fact, but they felt real to Marcus Turner as he approached the driver's side window, and that feeling was enough to shape everything that happened next. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where you made assumptions about someone based on incomplete information? Where you let your expectations shape your perception of reality instead of the other way around? I would be curious to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you have been following this story closely, I think you already sense where it is heading. Chief Washington watched in his side mirror as the officer approached. Even in the dim light, he could see the body language that concerned him. The officer's stride was too aggressive. His hand was positioned too close to his weapon. The flashlight was held high, in a position that would allow it to be used as a striking instrument if necessary. These were tells that any experienced law enforcement professional would recognize. This officer was approaching the stop as if he expected trouble. Darnell felt a familiar weariness settle over him. It was a feeling he had experienced countless times throughout his career, the exhausting reality of being a black man in America, even a black man who had risen to the highest position in his local police department. In situations like this, the burden of de-escalation often fell on the citizen, not the officer. The citizen had to be the one who remained calm, who moved slowly, who did everything possible to avoid triggering the fear or aggression of the officer standing at their window. He kept his hands on the steering wheel. He took a slow breath. He reminded himself that this would all be over in a few minutes and he would be home watching basketball. The flashlight beam hit him directly in the eyes. This was Marcus Turner's first mistake, though far from his last. Shining a flashlight directly into a driver's face at close range is not standard protocol. It is aggressive, disorienting, and counterproductive. It makes it harder for the driver to follow instructions and creates an adversarial tone from the very first moment of contact. Proper training teaches officers to illuminate the interior of the vehicle without blinding the occupant. But proper training assumes an officer who wants to de-escalate rather than intimidate. Darnell squinted against the light, but kept his hands where they were. He could barely make out the face behind the flashlight. Young, white, a name tag that he could not quite read in the glare. He waited for the officer to speak first, another standard practice that showed respect for the officer's control of the situation. The words that came were clipped and aggressive, license and registration. There was no greeting, no explanation for the stop, no attempt at basic human courtesy. Just a demand delivered in a tone that suggested the driver had already been judged guilty of something. Chief Washington responded in a calm, measured voice. He explained that he would need to reach into his back pocket for his wallet, which contained his license, and then into his glove compartment for the registration. He announced each movement before making it, just as he had trained thousands of officers to instruct citizens to do. He moved slowly and deliberately, making sure his hands were always visible. Marcus watched these movements with a growing sense of suspicion. Why was this man being so careful? Why was he narrating his actions like he knew police procedure? In Marcus's mind, this suggested that the driver had experience with traffic stops, perhaps too much experience. Maybe he had a criminal record. Maybe he was on parole and knew that any wrong move could send him back to prison. The assumptions continued to build, each one feeding into the next, constructing a narrative of danger that existed only in Marcus's imagination. The chief retrieved his wallet and extracted his driver's license. He held it out toward the window, still moving with careful deliberation. Then he leaned toward the glove compartment to retrieve the registration. This was the moment when everything went wrong. Marcus saw the driver lean to the right, toward the glove compartment. In his heightened state of alertness, this movement did not register as a man reaching for his registration. It registered as a potential threat. What if there was a weapon in the glove compartment? What if the driver was going for a gun? "Stop moving," Marcus shouted, his voice cracking with sudden intensity. "Keep your hands where I can see them." Chief Washington froze. His hand was on the glove compartment latch, exactly where he had said it would be, doing exactly what the officer had asked him to do. Confusion flickered across his face. He had announced his intentions. He was following the procedure that every citizen should follow during a traffic stop. Why was the officer reacting as if he had done something wrong? "Sir," the chief said, keeping his voice steady, "you asked for my registration. That is what I am reaching for. I said stop moving." Marcus's hand was on his taser now. His training, such as it was, had drilled into him the principle that action beats reaction. If a suspect was going for a weapon, you could not wait to see the weapon before responding. You had to act first. But the corollary to that principle, the part about accurately assessing whether there was actually a threat, seemed to have escaped him entirely. In the sedan, Darnell Washington felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. He had been in law enforcement for more than 3 decades. He had seen situations like this unfold before, though always from the other side. He knew with terrible certainty that he was dealing with an officer who had lost control of his own fear, an officer who was no longer seeing reality, but instead seeing the threat he had constructed in his own mind. For a moment, Darnell considered identifying himself. He could pull out his badge, announce that he was the chief of police, and probably bring this entire situation to an immediate halt. But something stopped him. Maybe it was principle. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was the exhausting knowledge that if he was not the chief, If he was just an ordinary citizen with brown skin sitting in a nice car on a quiet street, he would have no badge to protect him. And if that ordinary citizen would be in danger right now, then something was deeply broken in the system Darnell had dedicated his life to serving. So instead of reaching for his badge, Chief Washington spoke with the calm authority that came from 32 years of experience. "Officer, I need you to listen to me carefully. I am reaching for my vehicle registration because you asked me to produce it. My hands have been visible the entire time. I have announced every movement before making it. There is no weapon in my glove compartment. There is no weapon anywhere in this vehicle. I need you to take a breath and lower your taser." But Marcus Turner was beyond listening. The voice of experience trying to reach him sounded like something else entirely. It sounded like defiance. It sounded like a suspect trying to talk his way out of trouble. It sounded like the kind of verbal resistance that his academy instructors had warned him about. The suspects who tried to manipulate officers with words while preparing to attack with weapons. In reality, those instructors had probably never intended their warnings to apply to a 56-year-old man calmly sitting in his vehicle after a budget meeting. But Marcus had absorbed their lessons without the context necessary to apply them appropriately. He had learned to fear without learning to discern when fear was justified. "I am not going to tell you again," Marcus said. His finger moved to the taser's trigger. Chief Washington saw the movement. In that instant, he understood what was about to happen. A dozen possible responses flashed through his mind. He could shout that he was the chief. He could try to open the door and step out of the vehicle. He could make a grab for the taser. All of these options carried risks. All of them required him to move. He chose the safest option. He chose to remain perfectly still and wait for the young officer to regain his senses. It was the right choice. It should have been enough. It was not. Marcus Turner pressed the trigger. The taser's probes launched from the cartridge with a sharp crack. They covered the short distance between the weapon and its target almost instantaneously, burying themselves in Chief Washington's torso. Then 50,000 volts of electricity began coursing through the chief's body. The human body has no defense against this kind of assault. Voluntary muscle control ceases immediately. The victim experiences what can only be described as total physical betrayal, as their own muscles contract violently against their will. It is not painful in the conventional sense. It is something worse. It is the complete loss of autonomy, the terrifying experience of having your body commandeered by an outside force. Chief Washington's back arched against the seat. His hands, which had been resting on the steering wheel, clenched into fists. His jaw locked shut, preventing him from speaking or crying out. For 5 seconds that felt like an eternity, he was utterly helpless, a passenger in his own body while it convulsed in response to the electrical current. Then the current stopped. The taser's standard 5-second cycle had completed. Chief Washington slumped forward, his forehead coming to rest against the top of the steering wheel. He gasped for breath, his muscles twitching with residual contractions, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. He had been tased. He, the chief of police, had been tased by one of his own officers during a routine traffic stop. The absurdity of it almost made him want to laugh. The outrage of it made him want to scream. But he did neither. He focused on breathing, on recovering, on regaining enough control of his body to speak. Outside the vehicle, Marcus Turner was already reaching for his handcuffs. In his mind, he had just subdued a potentially dangerous suspect. The driver had been argumentative and resistant. He had refused to comply with simple commands. The use of the taser had been necessary to gain control of the situation. This was going to look good on his report. This might even earn him recognition. "Open the door slowly and step out of the vehicle," Marcus commanded. "Keep your hands where I can see them." Chief Washington managed to lift his head from the steering wheel. His muscles were still trembling. His heart was racing from the combination of the electrical shock and the surge of adrenaline flooding his system. But his mind was clearing, and with that clarity came a cold, hard anger, unlike anything he had felt in years. He did not open the door. Instead, he spoke, his voice ragged but unmistakably authoritative. "Officer, what is your badge number?" The question caught Marcus off guard. This was not how suspects typically responded after being tased. They did not ask for badge numbers. They complained, they cursed, they begged. They did not calmly request the identifying information of the officer who had just incapacitated them. "I gave you an order," Marcus said, but some of the confidence had drained from his voice. "Step out of the vehicle." Chief Washington finally turned to look directly at the young officer standing at his window. The flashlight was still blazing, but the chief no longer bothered to shield his eyes. He wanted this officer to see his face clearly. He wanted there to be no mistake about what was about to happen. "My name," the chief said, "is Darnell Washington. I am the chief of police of the Ashford City Police Department. You have just deployed your taser against your commanding officer without legal justification. I am ordering you as your superior to holster your weapons, return to your vehicle, and radio for a supervisor to respond to this location immediately." The words hit Marcus Turner like a physical blow. His mind rejected them initially, unable to process the reality they described. This could not be the chief. The chief would not be driving around with a broken taillight. The chief would have identified himself immediately. The chief would not be out here alone on a Tuesday night. But even as these denials cycled through his thoughts, Marcus's eyes were taking in details he had failed to notice before. The quality of the man's clothing, expensive even in its disheveled state. The way he carried himself, even after being tased, with an authority that seemed innate rather than performed. The face now illuminated by the flashlight's glare that Marcus realized he had seen before in photographs, at department meetings, on the local news. The flashlight slipped from Marcus's suddenly nerveless fingers. It hit the pavement with a plastic clatter and rolled away, its beam spinning wild patterns across the road surface. His taser, still clutched in his other hand, suddenly felt impossibly heavy. His legs felt weak. His stomach lurched. "Oh God," he whispered. "Oh my God." In that moment, Officer Marcus Turner understood that his career was over. Everything he had worked for, everything he had hoped to achieve, all of it had evaporated in the 5 seconds it took for a taser's electrical cycle to complete. He had committed the one error that could not be explained away or minimized. He had assaulted the chief of police without justification, and he had done it while wearing a body camera that had recorded every moment. Consider this turning point for a moment. Consider how one decision made in a span of seconds can destroy years of effort and aspiration. Consider how the assumptions we carry with us, the biases we fail to examine, can lead us to actions that cannot be undone. If you find yourself thinking about a time when a snap judgment led you somewhere you did not intend to go, I would genuinely like to hear about it in the comments. Chief Washington opened his car door and stepped out slowly. His muscles were still not fully under his control, and he leaned against the vehicle for support. He looked at the young officer standing before him, saw the terror and confusion on his face, and felt a complex mixture of emotions that would take him weeks to fully untangle. There was anger, certainly. White-hot anger at being assaulted, at being treated like a criminal, at being subjected to the very kind of abuse he had spent his career trying to eliminate from policing. But there was also something else, a weary recognition that this young officer was not an anomaly, but a symptom. Marcus Turner was the product of a system that had failed to properly train him, failed to properly supervise him, failed to identify and address his deficiencies before they resulted in exactly this kind of incident. Backup was already on the way. Marcus had radioed for an additional unit before approaching the vehicle, standard practice for any traffic stop. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder in the night air, and soon a second patrol car came around the bend, its lights flashing. The officer who stepped out was Sergeant Monica Reyes, a 15-year veteran who had known Chief Washington since he was a captain. Her reaction to the scene before her, her chief, leaning against a sedan with taser probes still embedded in his shirt, a patrol officer standing frozen in shock beside him, would have been almost comical under different circumstances. "Chief," she said, her voice tight with confusion and concern. "What happened here?" Darnell Washington looked at her. Then he looked at Marcus Turner. Then he looked up at the stars overhead, at the vast, indifferent sky that had witnessed this entire debacle. "Sergeant Reyes," he said finally, "please secure Officer Turner's weapons and take him back to the station. I will need someone to drive me home. I will provide a full statement in the morning." The next several hours were a blur of activity. An ambulance was called to check on the chief, who refused transport but allowed paramedics to remove the taser probes and examine him for any injuries. The incident report was started, though it would take days to complete. Phone calls were made, waking up deputy chiefs and internal affairs investigators and city officials who would need to be briefed before the story broke publicly. Marcus Turner was driven back to the station by Sergeant Reyes. He did not speak during the drive. He sat in the back of her patrol car, in the same seat where he had placed arrested suspects countless times, staring at his hands as if he did not recognize them. When they arrived at the station, he was escorted to an interview room where he would wait for hours before anyone came to take his statement. Chief Washington did eventually make it home that night, though it was well after midnight by the time he walked through his front door. His wife, Margaret, had been waiting up, worried by his unusual lateness. When she saw the disheveled state of his clothes and the haunted look in his eyes, her worry transformed into alarm. Darnell told her everything. He sat at their kitchen table, the basketball game long since over on the television in the other room, and he told his wife of 30 years about being pulled over, being blinded by a flashlight, being ordered to stop moving when he was only following instructions, being shot with a taser by a young officer who had seen threat where there was only an ordinary citizen trying to get home. Margaret Washington listened in silence. She had been married to a police officer for 3 decades. She understood the dangers of the job, the split-second decisions, the impossible situations. But this was different. This was her husband, the most senior law enforcement officer in the city, being treated like a criminal by someone under his own command. It was unacceptable, and the anger in her eyes when Darnell finished his account was fiercer than anything he had seen in years. "What are you going to do?" she asked. Darnell looked at her for a long moment before answering. "My job," he said simply. The investigation that followed was swift by the standards of police internal affairs, though it still took nearly 4 weeks to complete. Every aspect of the traffic stop was scrutinized. The body camera footage was reviewed frame by frame. Marcus Turner's personnel file was pulled and examined in its entirety. Interviews were conducted with his training officers, his supervisors, his colleagues. Witness statements were taken from Sergeant Reyes and the other officers who had responded to the scene. The findings were damning. The footage from Marcus's body camera showed exactly what Chief Washington had described. A traffic stop that had been aggressive from the very first moment. A flashlight shoved in the driver's face. Commands delivered in a hostile tone. No attempt at de-escalation, no effort to assess the actual level of threat presented by the situation. And then, without any justification whatsoever, the deployment of a taser against a citizen who had done nothing more than reach for his vehicle registration exactly as he had announced he would do. The Internal Affairs investigation also uncovered the pattern in Marcus Turner's history that should have been identified long before this night. The warnings from his field training officer, the complaints from citizens, the incident at the college party where he had drawn his weapon unnecessarily. All of these red flags had been documented, but none of them had resulted in meaningful intervention. The system designed to identify and correct problem officers had failed at every level. Marcus Turner was terminated from the Ashford City Police Department on a Thursday afternoon, 24 days after the incident. The official reason given was violation of department policies regarding use of force and conduct unbecoming an officer. He was given the opportunity to resign in lieu of termination, which would have allowed him to avoid having a firing on his record, but he refused, apparently still believing at some level that he had done nothing wrong. His union representative filed an appeal, arguing that the termination was excessive and that a suspension or additional training would have been appropriate. The appeal was denied. The arbitrator who reviewed the case wrote in his decision that the evidence of misconduct was overwhelming and that no reasonable officer in Officer Turner's position would have perceived the threat he claimed to have perceived. The arbitrator also noted that the officer's history suggested a pattern of behavior that the department had failed to adequately address, but that this failure did not excuse the officer's own culpability. The story inevitably became public. In the age of social media and 24-hour news cycles, there was no possibility of keeping such an incident quiet. A local reporter received a tip about the traffic stop within days of it occurring, and soon the story was everywhere. The details were too compelling, too perfectly emblematic of larger issues in American policing for the media to resist. Police officer tases his own chief during traffic stop. The headlines wrote themselves. The story was picked up by national news outlets. Cable news pundits debated its implications. Social media erupted with commentary, with some defending Marcus Turner and others calling for far more severe consequences than mere termination. What captured the public imagination most powerfully was the racial dimension of the incident. Here was a black police chief, a man who had dedicated his life to law enforcement, being treated with the same suspicion and aggression that so many other black Americans reported experiencing during encounters with police. If this could happen to the chief of police, commentators asked, what chance did an ordinary citizen have? This question hung over Ashford City like a storm cloud in the weeks following the story's release. Community forums were organized, protests were held, though they remained peaceful. Calls for reform grew louder. The city council, which had been considering cuts to the police department's training budget, reversed course entirely and approved a substantial increase in funding for de-escalation training and implicit bias education. Chief Washington found himself in an uncomfortable spotlight. Reporters wanted interviews. Activists wanted him to speak at rallies. Politicians wanted to associate themselves with him. He declined most of these requests, preferring to address the situation through official channels rather than media appearances. But he did make one public statement delivered at a press conference that was carried live by every local television station, and several national ones happened to him on the night in question, not in angry terms, but in the measured language of someone trying to teach rather than condemn. He talked about the importance of proper training and supervision. He talked about the need for accountability at every level of law enforcement. He talked about the broken relationship between police departments and communities of color, and his belief that this relationship could only be repaired through sustained, honest effort on both sides. Then he said something that surprised many listeners. I do not want Officer Turner to become a symbol of everything wrong with policing in America. He is a young man who made terrible decisions, enabled by a system that failed to prepare him properly and failed to intervene when warning signs appeared. He is responsible for his actions, and he is paying the price for them. But we are all responsible for the system that produced him. I am responsible for it, and I intend to spend whatever time I have left in this position working to change it. The reforms that followed were substantial. Chief Washington established new protocols for identifying and addressing problematic patterns in officer behavior. He created an early intervention system that would flag officers who accumulated multiple complaints or showed signs of concerning conduct. He mandated additional training in de-escalation techniques for all officers, with refresher courses required every year. He expanded the department's community policing initiatives, placing greater emphasis on building relationships with residents rather than simply enforcing laws. These changes did not happen overnight. They encountered resistance from some quarters, officers who felt they were being punished for the sins of one bad actor. Budget constraints limited how quickly new programs could be implemented. Old habits proved difficult to break. But Chief Washington was persistent, and gradually, over the final years of his tenure, the culture of the Ashford City Police Department began to shift. As for Marcus Turner, his story after termination followed a depressingly predictable arc. He applied to other police departments in the region and was rejected by all of them. His name had become too well known, his face too recognizable from the news coverage. No department wanted to take on the liability of hiring an officer who had tased his own chief. He moved out of state, eventually settling in a small town in the Southwest where no one knew his history. He found work as a security guard at a shopping mall, a job that paid less than half of what he had earned as a police officer and offered none of the respect or authority he had once possessed. He never spoke publicly about what had happened, never gave interviews, never offered excuses or apologies. He simply disappeared into the anonymity of ordinary American life. Some who followed the story wondered whether Marcus Turner ever truly understood what he had done wrong, whether he recognized that his assumptions about Chief Washington had been shaped by bias rather than evidence, whether he understood that his eagerness to see threats where none existed had been a flaw in himself, not a virtue. There was no way to know for certain. The Marcus Turner who emerged from this incident seemed diminished in every way, a cautionary tale whose moral he himself might never have grasped. Chief Darnell Washington served for another 4 years after the incident, retiring at the age of 60 with more than 3 decades of service behind him. His retirement ceremony was attended by hundreds of current and former officers, community members, city officials, and representatives from police departments across the region who had studied and admired his reform efforts. In his farewell speech, he reflected on the strange path his career had taken, from idealistic young officer to decorated detective to influential chief to victim of the very problems he had spent his career trying to address. He talked about the night he was tased by his own officer, something he rarely discussed publicly, and what it had taught him about the persistence of bias and the importance of systemic change. People ask me if I am angry about what happened that night, he said. The honest answer is that I was angry for a long time. I was angry at Officer Turner. I was angry at the supervisors who should have identified his problems earlier. I was angry at a system that allows these failures to occur again and again. But anger only takes you so far. Eventually, you have to decide whether you want to be consumed by it or whether you want to channel it into something constructive. I chose construction. He paused, looking out at the assembled crowd. What I experienced that night is what Black Americans experience every day, he continued. The presumption of guilt, the aggressive response to innocent behavior, the fear that one wrong move, even when you have done nothing wrong, could cost you everything. The difference for me was that I had a badge and a title that eventually protected me. Most people do not have that protection. Most people have only their humanity, and for too many officers, that is not enough. We have to do better. We have to be better. That is the only legacy I want to leave behind. Chief Washington's legacy extended beyond his tenure. The reforms he implemented in Ashford City became models for other departments across the country. The early intervention system he created was studied by researchers and adopted by police forces in more than 40 cities. The de-escalation training program he championed became the basis for new state-mandated training requirements for all law enforcement officers. He wrote a book after retirement, a memoir that combined his personal story with prescriptions for police reform. It became a bestseller and required reading in many criminal justice programs. He was invited to speak at conferences and universities, to testify before legislative committees, to consult with departments struggling with similar issues. At the age of 63, he was awarded an honorary doctorate from the State University for his contributions to criminal justice reform. The sedan with the broken taillight became a piece of local legend. Some versions of the story claimed that Chief Washington had the repair bill framed and displayed in his office, a reminder of how small problems can lead to large consequences if not addressed. Whether this was true or apocryphal, the symbolism resonated. It captured something essential about the incident and its aftermath, the way a $38 maintenance issue had exposed failures worth millions of dollars in training and supervision. The badge that Marcus Turner had worn was eventually reassigned to a new officer, a young woman who had graduated at the top of her academy class and demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment and restraint that her predecessor had lacked. There was something fitting about this transfer, a sense of redemption and continuation. The uniform meant something. The badge meant something. They represented ideals that existed independently of any individual who might wear them. So what are we to make of this story? What lessons does it offer to those of us watching from outside the world of law enforcement? Perhaps the most obvious lesson is about the persistence and danger of bias. Marcus Turner looked at Chief Washington and saw threat where there was none. He saw a large black man in an expensive car and constructed a narrative of criminality that had no basis in reality. This bias was not conscious or deliberate. Marcus probably would have denied holding any prejudice if asked directly, but it was there nonetheless, shaping his perceptions and driving his decisions in ways he did not recognize or understand. This kind of implicit bias is not unique to police officers. It exists in all of us, shaped by our experiences, our environment, the media we consume, the stories we are told about, who is dangerous and who is safe. The difference is that police officers carry weapons and have the authority to use force. Their biases can result in injury or death. That is why training to recognize and counteract these biases is so essential, and why the failure to provide such training represents such a profound dereliction of responsibility. Another lesson concerns the importance of systems over individuals. It is tempting to view this story as a tale of one bad officer whose misconduct was eventually punished, But that framing lets the system off the hook too easily. Marcus Turner's problems were documented for years before the incident with Chief Washington. Multiple people had identified his tendency to escalate situations and respond with excessive force. None of these warnings resulted in meaningful intervention. The system failed, training failed, supervision failed, internal oversight failed. By the time Marcus Turner pulled over Chief Washington's sedan, he had already been given countless opportunities to harm innocent citizens. It was only the identity of his victim on this particular night that ensured he would finally be held accountable. How many others had he mistreated who lacked the power and visibility to demand consequences? The story does not tell us, but the question haunts the narrative. Finally, there is a lesson about leadership and its limits. Chief Washington was, by all accounts, an exemplary leader. He had risen through the ranks, implemented reforms, held his officers to high standards, and yet he was unable to prevent one of his own officers from assaulting him during a routine traffic stop. His presence at the top of the department had not been sufficient to transform the culture and practices of every officer under his command. It had not been enough to identify and remove a problematic officer before he caused serious harm. This is humbling. It suggests that even the most dedicated and capable leaders face constraints in their ability to change institutions. It suggests that reform is not something that happens once and then endures forever, but rather an ongoing process that requires constant vigilance and renewal. Chief Washington understood this. His response to the incident was not to claim that the problem was solved once Marcus Turner was fired, but to redouble his efforts at systemic change, knowing that the work would never truly be complete. I want to end by returning to the moment itself. That moment when Marcus Turner stood at the window of Chief Washington's sedan, flashlight blazing, hand on his taser, mind clouded by assumptions and fears. That moment when the chief sat perfectly still, hands on the steering wheel, knowing that he was about to be unjustly attacked, but choosing not to exercise the privilege that might have protected him. There is something profound in that choice. Chief Washington could have ended the encounter at any point by identifying himself. He chose not to, not out of pride or stubbornness, but out of a principled commitment to equality under the law. He believed that who he was should not determine how he was treated by law enforcement. He believed that if an ordinary citizen would be in danger in his position, then something was deeply wrong. He was right. Something was deeply wrong. And his willingness to experience that wrongness personally, to refuse the protection his status would have provided, gave him a moral authority to speak about police reform that he might not otherwise have possessed. His suffering, though unjust, became a catalyst for change. This is not to say that Chief Washington should have been tased, or that good things came from a bad act. The incident was a failure at every level, but in the aftermath of that failure, Chief Washington made choices about how to respond that transformed a moment of personal trauma into an opportunity for institutional reform. That is leadership. That is wisdom. That is the kind of response to injustice that makes the world slightly better than it was before. As we reach the end of this story, I find myself wondering what you would have done in Chief Washington's position. Would you have identified yourself immediately, ending the confrontation before it escalated? Would you have remained silent, as he did, out of principle? Would you have responded with anger in the aftermath, or with the measured determination to change the system that the chief displayed? These are not easy questions. They do not have right answers, but they are worth asking, worth sitting with, worth discussing. If you have thoughts to share, I would genuinely like to hear them in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, if it made you think about issues you had not considered before, I would be grateful if you would consider subscribing to this channel. There are more stories like this one, stories that reveal something true about the world we live in, and I would be honored to share them with you. The broken taillight was eventually repaired. The cost was $38.27, a trivial sum that somehow became a symbol for everything that had gone wrong that night. Small problems left unaddressed can lead to enormous consequences. That is true for taillight bulbs. It is true for problematic officers. It is true for systemic failures in training and oversight. It is true for the biases we carry within us, the assumptions we make about others based on how they look rather than who they are. Chief Darnell Washington understood this truth. He spent the final years of his career and the years of his retirement trying to ensure that others understood it too. His legacy is not the night he was tased by his own officer. His legacy is what he built in the aftermath of that night. The reforms, the training programs, the early intervention systems, the countless officers who learned to do their jobs better because of the changes he championed. And somewhere, in a small town in the Southwest, a former police officer works as a security guard, walking the corridors of a shopping mall, watching shoppers come and go. Does he think about the night that ended his career? Does he understand even now what he did wrong? Does he recognize the bias that clouded his judgment, the assumptions that led him to see threat where there was only an ordinary citizen trying to get home? We will probably never know. Marcus Turner faded into obscurity, a cautionary tale whose moral he himself may never have learned. His story is a reminder that consequences do not always bring understanding, that punishment does not always produce growth. Sometimes people simply endure the results of their actions without ever grasping why those actions were wrong. But the story does not end with Marcus Turner. It ends with the changes that followed, with the officers who are trained better now, who are supervised more closely, who are held to higher standards. It ends with a system that is slightly more likely to catch the next Marcus Turner before he harms an innocent citizen. It ends with the hope, fragile but real, that the lessons of this incident will prevent others like it from occurring. That is the only kind of ending a story like this can have. Not a happy ending, exactly. The harm that was done cannot be undone. Chief Washington carries the memory of that night with him, the knowledge of what it feels like to be presumed dangerous by someone who had sworn to protect him. That memory does not disappear just because reforms were implemented, but it is an ending with meaning, an ending where something was learned, where something changed, where the suffering was transmuted into purpose. In a world full of stories that end in futility and despair, that counts for something. It has to count for something. Thank you for staying with me through this entire story. If you found value in this deep dive into one moment and its consequences, please take a second to subscribe and share this video with others who might appreciate it. The more people who engage with stories like this, the better our collective understanding of the challenges we face and the possibilities for change. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other, and remember that the choices we make in our smallest moments can define us just as surely as the choices we make in our largest ones. The night on Ridgemont Avenue is over. The consequences continue to unfold, and the work of building a more just world, a world where no one is presumed guilty based on how they look, goes on. That work belongs to all of us. It always has.